I suppose one thing that strikes me immediately is, in some cases, how incredibly easy hacking is, in the sense that, Hibby, you, when you talked about the Homeland event, you know, an incredibly powerful, you'd think rigorously controlled organisation, but, you know, a big TV production company would kind of know better. And there was this sort of enormous chink in its armour, which was that they weren't interested in the squiggly lines that you were drawing on a set in Berlin. And I suppose also the banality of it all, the ridiculousness of it all in a way, the aesthetics of calling your big spying system Five Eyes, as if you have been reading a lot of thrillers. Perhaps you've even been reading Lord of the Rings. There's a kind of Eye of Sauron aspect to it. It struck me, Brett, when you were talking about the banality of the workplace, which I also, you know, I work in a big institution, and, you know, one does one's little minor acts of subversion to write long articles about Mark Lecky or whatever it is that nobody wants you to do. Yeah, the sort of banality of the open plan office and the kind of tediousness of it in a way. These enormous power structures. These are all ideas about aesthetics, I suppose. Just to bring it to a question before I ramble my head off. Brett, I want to know from you a bit about the ethics of what you were doing when you went into the financial industry. And I know you've addressed some of these questions or potential objections to what you were doing there in very eloquently in essays that you've written, but I want to ask you, I mean, some people, this just to be devil's advocate, some people might say that actually you were taking away a very nice salary being a financial derivatives trader, and kind of kidding yourself that you were sort of undermining the system from within. So what really was what was that, as it were, the outcome, attempted out, the aim of the exercise?
Just to clarify, I wasn't actually a trader, I was a broker. But,
as a broker. Of course, I have
so
no idea.
So it doesn't
you
matter,
can explain
right
these, I have no idea what any of
Brokers
these things
work for
mean.
traders.
Yeah,
it's
right.
fun. I don't really, normally don't really like talking about I mean, I do enjoy talking about it. When I'm ever at parties and you try to explain these types of concepts, the problem that most people in society has to have is they have a bunch of preconceived categories in their heads for certain things. So, for example, there's the concept of the activist. People understand it. There's the concept of the banker, all right? And these things tend to be quite mutually exclusive, and you can sort of blend them to some extent, but most people can't conceptualize the breaching between those things. So whenever you suggest some kind of breach, they automatically fall into a number of ways of reconciling it. And there's 3 ways you normally do it with what I was doing. So what a lot of activists think I was doing was, quote unquote, going undercover in the belly of the beast. Okay, so think about how it works. That's this concept of a person who's actually an activist goes into something which is like the opposite of that, and they sort of like spy while they're there, right? And it's like the American agent undercover in Russia or something in the Cold War. That's a very easy to understand concept, right? It maintains the binary, simple. Alternatively, there's another one which is called selling out, which is like you sort of thought you were an activist, but actually all along you really were actually a mainstream person. And what you're really doing is that you're sort of like covertly and passively being sucked into the system, and you're now actually that was really what's going on. Yeah, I get that a lot. Then there's a third category, which is the reformed banker, which was you were always actually a normal banker, and then you decided to become an activist, or like you decided to become socially conscious. And notice like all 3 of these never at one point ever breach any concept that you can be both of those things at the same time, right? So what I was really doing was, on the one hand, trying to mess with a bunch of these different categories. So messing with activist culture itself, because within activist culture, there's a lot of rigidity, actually, about what's considered valid activism versus what's not considered valid activism. So I was messing with that, but I was also obviously messing with the actual people, or the sort of structures within the finance, the actual people who thought I was doing a real job there. Now, there are like dubious ethics that come with that because you can abuse people by doing that. So actually within hacker culture, there's quite like a dubious element called social engineering where they literally try to con people. It's basically a fancy way of saying we con people and we manipulate them and lie to them. And I've always been careful to try and be sort of empathetic to people who, if I'm ever doing this kind of activity, which is actually like taking people seriously, like there are people with real lives and real jobs, and you might not like them, but you have to actually treat them as human beings. And also I wasn't making very much money, to be honest, because I was, but that doesn't really matter whether that's the case or not. But during the financial crisis, things were not as amazing as people think they are. Anyway, hopefully that's answers some of your questions.
I'm interested because, of course, when the state undertakes that kind of activity, we might not be so approving. So, for instance, Mark Kennedy, the undercover policeman who was employed by the Metropolitan Police and had, was employed to infiltrate green activists, formed relationships with women, and this was obviously, in some ways it's been described as a kind of state rape. So these women were being abused by the state. So if one turns it around, the opposite dynamic is quite sort of hard to shift ethically. Simon, I want to pick up on this sort of notion of the grey area with you as well. The sense that, I suppose the first time I saw your work, the first time I heard you talk about your work, I was sort of amazed and intrigued that you had an enormous admiration, in a way, for the organisations you were unpicking, or at least you didn't despise them. I thought he's going to be... When when you did that work on the NSA and the aesthetics of the NSA, insofar as one could do it, based on the leaked material and other material that you had amassed, I thought he's going to really, he's going to have it in, he's going to be terribly angry about this, and I'm sure in lots of ways you probably are angry about it, but you had a kind of affection almost for the material. You weren't poking fun at the aesthetics, and it's things like, when you've done your work about, say, the corporate conference, it's almost like you fall in love with the lanyards and the kind of the big screens and the corporate paraphernalia. Can you talk a bit about that? Because I find it intriguing.
Yeah, I think that's a really clear follow-on also from what Brett was just saying about his experience going into banking. I kind of, I come from an art background and I went to art college, not too dissimilar from this one. That comes with a position as well, and a kind of like an ideological background maybe, and kind of like tendencies to like certain things and not like other things. And some of the things I started to be interested in was things that people that I was hanging out with didn't really like. And then one of those first things were kind of like events and kind of lectures and I don't know, what would you call it? Yeah, these kind of conferences that I went to. And the more that I got close to the people that were involved in those, the more I was like into it in the end. And so I was this kind of complete floating, non-opinionated person, and who was like having a great time wherever I was, because I kind of got into the feeling of being there, And I think, one of the great things that I think I got out of an art school context was were some of the smarter people that I was in touch with there, or some of the people that I identified with more, were like really into crazy things that nobody else would be into. And that, as a kind of ethic, I guess, led me into this type of work. But I think treating people like humans and kind of appreciating where things come from also lets you have a kind of like more nuanced understanding of what life is, and kind of exiting maybe these binaries that you were talking about was a bit what this show is about as well. People might think of hacking and surveillance agencies or formalized organizations and casual groupings of people as things that are kind of never mixing. And I want to kind of try and create with my work, and what this always led me through, is to kind of try and make a kind of acute, fun way of engaging with a more complex landscape. Simply because I felt that when I was engaged in that way, my appreciation of life kind of went up. So, I really fell in love with the work of the former creative director of the NSA. I found his work really engaging, genuinely engaging, and I was very excited to commission him a new project. At the
Which
same
he did without revealing
Right.
that he was commissioning work for the New Zealand Pavilion of the Venice Biennale.
Right. So, but at the same time, exactly, I was also performing another kind of gesture, which was not taking into account his feelings and his thoughts, as a kind of demonstration of how some of these types of activities are applied. So I was sort of trying to invert and revoke and mix some of these genres, and I think that this is. Yeah, I'm really just excited when I feel like I'm learning and when I feel like new things are presented to me. And I think doing those types of exchanges with intention and with admiration is where that kind of starts.
Yeah, and Brett, I feel like it came down rather hard on you in a kind of slightly unnecessary way. But I was just trying to tease this sort of. These statements out of you, but where did you, having been in that organisation and done that work and thought about it a lot, where did that sort of shift your world perspective onto? Where did you sort of get to? I mean, clearly you had begun to understand all kinds of things that I know that I will never understand. I don't know the difference between a trader and whatever it was you said. You do.
Well, I guess there's, just as a general point, if any of you are kind of interested in this thing, maybe this concept, because this is a concept that applies beyond the financial sector. I mean, I know people who contact me too, that go and work in, the weapons industry or different, mining industries and oil rigs.
You
and
could
so on.
probably do it in an art school.
Yeah, it was as many. It's intriguing.
That's what I was doing today.
But there's a kind of like one of the immediate aims is you learn stuff, So I've learned. I can tell you about derivatives if you really want to know. I mean, it's not particularly useful for you to know right now, but I could if you wanted me to. But I guess the most important thing really is in these processes you get to understand the human dynamics. And I guess this is why I was talking about Gonzo journalism, because Gonzo journalism, a lot of the point of what Gonzo journalism as a tradition has been, albeit it's a bit like subdued, is basically this idea of trying to start empathize with people and sort of see how they experience these things. Rather than viewing it from an outsider perspective, and that's an anthropological thing as well. So once you get into these systems, you start to realize how internal to different structures, to different bureaucratic structures and different types of organizations, people are within a social setting that starts to condition the way that they think. So we're actually within GCHQ, for example, if you're an analyst sitting there, you're going to be surrounded by all sorts of people who are constantly validating your views and telling you certain things, and you're going to be under pressure to start to conform to that worldview. Even if once you leave that building, you might be part of a different social set that gives you different ideas. And this is quite an interesting process to realize that there's a distinction between the institutions and the individuals. The institutions are partly created by these individuals, but they also somehow exist above and beyond the people within them. So actually, financial institutions frequently bring things out of people. And when they leave that setting, that stuff disappears. So they become assholes in the context of a bank, And that's quite an important sort of thing to try and figure out. But also the last thing I'll say about it is an important thing for me was to realize how imperfect the knowledge was. A lot of people outside of these settings tend to imagine these powerful institutions as somehow being in control of everything. And somehow knowing what's going on and what's happening. Actually, frequently within the financial sector, which is probably one of the most powerful industries in the world, people have no idea what's going on. But they command the language, so it sounds like people have an idea what's going on. So there's an interesting, once you learn to get past that, you don't feel so bad for not knowing things, because nobody really knows anything.
We're here, this is the week of an incredibly significant week in Egyptian history. It's the 5-year anniversary since the shutting down of the internet, as you talked about. It's the 5-year anniversary since the whole Arab Spring and the removal of Mubarak. And that period in Egypt's history was a period of extraordinary efflorescence in kind of everyday, what you'd call, I suppose, everyday acts of subversion and creativity. The extraordinary, I mean, you've spoken about this. One can, if you Google Hiba, you can see her giving a really intriguing talk about the street art in Tahrir Square and environs that became internet memes and then kind of retranslated itself back into the street. And perhaps the first time that sort of dynamic has ever occurred in a sort of in a political revolution. But since we're here now, I want to ask you how efficacious all that work was. I mean, we're now in a period in Egypt where journalists are being imprisoned. It feels like this extraordinary moment of freedom of expression has had a limited life. How would you respond to that?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, we are 5 years later in a very kind of down moment. In fact, journalists and artists and art institutions are being shut down. People are disappearing. People are being detained for no logical reasons. I mean, this is also what's a bit scary about it, is now it's not just about dissidents. It's not just about speaking against the government, but it could be anything. And so there is this kind of extreme mass paranoia that's happening, which is also, what I was trying to bring up with this narrative of the stork, right? That anything becomes a threat. So this idea of creativity there's been a cap that's put on it, and it's much more difficult to express yourself on social media or on the internet. And in fact, many Facebook administrators are being detained now for whatever reasons. But having said that, I mean, there are still people doing things. Like, for example, on the 25th, a few days ago, there was a guy who went out and in celebrating, mocking the police day, he handed out condoms as balloons. And that suddenly became a meme, and now everybody is kind of inserting images of condoms in relation to the revolution and kind of poking fun of where we are today. So in a way, I think these things are never really shut down, no matter how extreme things might get. I think there's always people who are willing to take risks, and those people then open it up further for artists and for activists and, for anyone to kind of, insert a moment of subversion.
I was intrigued when you were talking about the shutting down of the internet and the sort of alternative system that sprung up for tweeting, and that it was organised or developed by 2 Google employees. I mean, there's a little irony there, isn't there? And there's a
lot.
Corporate,
a lot of
fantastically powerful West Coast corporation, sort of becoming the conduit, presumably with pretty mixed. I mean, who knows? I don't know if you were able to contact them. And what were their motives?
In fact, funny enough, the platform SpeakToTweet was originally a platform called Say Now, and it was meant for teens to make phone calls to their teen idols. So This was the original intention. Yeah, pretty ironic. This was the original intention, and it hadn't been launched yet. And so when the internet shutdown happened, it was such a huge conversation in kind of the internet world, in the corporate world, because in fact it was a corporation that helped shut it down to begin with, right? It's not so easy to shut down the internet.
Do you know, have you worked out, how do you shut down the internet out of interest?
Yeah, it's quite complicated, but in Egypt it was possible because there's a very small ecosystem of service providers. So
right.
In fact, in Egypt it only has 4 main service providers, and as a result, I don't know, you can much more easily shut it down. Yeah, I mean, in the UK and the US, I don't think that's really possible on that scale. But yeah, I mean, it's quite ironic. So it was meant as this kind of entertainment. It was targeting the entertainment industry. And so when this happened, one of the developers actually was Egyptian. And so they came up with the idea to use it for Egypt, and in fact they were targeting the revolutionaries who were already, using social media quite heavily. But that's not who it ended up targeting, and it reached many other people. And I think what's really interesting to note about this is the way that it spread, because it was a mass SMS campaign that informed people. Of course, everybody in Egypt was shut down from information on the internet. They were completely wiped off the world's online maps. And a mass SMS campaign reached people in all corners of the country, and then people immediately started calling. I mean, the platform was spammed at one point. Pro-Mubarak people started calling. I was listening to it obsessively, and there was about 3 people who kept calling to kind of overwhelm the system, and in fact they had to change the number at some point and get that information out again and then people started using it again, and then in the meantime the internet came back up, so there was no use for it anymore. But it's also a very strange situation. I did contact the developers, and they are Google employees, which means Google owns it, but it's also on Twitter. So there's this very ambiguous, there's this ambiguity about who owns it. And as a result, because I'm using it for a project, you know, the developers were like, you know, just use it and don't involve us, because it's unclear where it stands.
How interesting, how interesting. Ryan's written an incredibly interesting catalogue essay in Simon's Projects for Organising Catalogue. And really it's a kind of, it's a little act of anthropology insofar as that is possible on GCHQ. And I find, well, I mean, clearly, I mean, I work for The Guardian, but the notion of GCHQ to me is very, very fascinating. And very, every time I go to Cheltenham, I fantasize that I'm surrounded by spies, and it's a very peculiar place, right? And there was a bit of news this week, wasn't there, about what are the most gay-friendly workplaces in Britain, and GCHQ came up very near the top.
MI5 was top, and I don't know where GCHQ was, but MI5.
MI5,
yeah.
Right? So yes, but yeah, but to me that seemed given what you'd written in the catalogue, that seemed only too natural, because of the sense of the way that system is kept unbreachable, except by the very occasional, and one of the points you make in your essay is how little that closed system is breached from, how few leaks there are, is by creating a sort of almost cultish atmosphere as the
well,
workplace.
it is, yeah.
Can you
I mean,
talk about
it's
that
like,
a bit?
yeah, well, that's, sorry. That's the title of that piece, was The Cult of GCHQ, because it is, I mean, it's like a society within society. It's a secret group. I mean, they really do function. If you look at like the, you know, the different things that make a cult, the sort of the reasons why a cult is a cult, the way that it excludes people, the way that people it punishes dissent, and the way that it's secret. It has its rules. It has a leader. You know, it's bizarre when you actually realise actually it functions like a cult. The intelligence community, that's how they function. It's how they're able to keep secrets, because they have to function like a cult. And but yeah, I mean the fact that they are now claiming to be like equal opportunity employers is really interesting, and
particularly given the history of
GCHQ,
homosexuals in the secret services, which was absolutely no go until relatively recently.
Well, Alan Turing's the most famous one, and he was associated with GCHQ, and he was totally banished at the time because of his sexuality. So, but obviously, it's a positive thing if they're being more inclusive now. But I think there's a bit of spin involved in all that, to be honest. The way they've tried to present themselves. At one point, GCHQ, I think it was for the Pride Festival or something, they lit up the outside of that donut building with the rainbow colours, you know, the gay pride colours. Which is just PR really for them. But
they did. Am I right in thinking that they have to, for the employees? This is what made me think it was all sort of within the same ballpark. Is that they have kind of family days and they have cricket matches at the middle. Maybe I'm inventing that, but there is this sort of, you know, you're in the family, and so that therefore it makes me think, well, it's perfectly natural then that they should be absolutely the best.
Well, they have to, because when you think about it, if you worked in there, and I mean everything you do, as soon as you leave at the end of the day, you can't talk to anyone about what you do at work. You know, you can say, "Oh, yeah, I'm a civil servant." That's about it. You can't say what you actually do. And even outside with your fellow employees, they're not really supposed to talk about it outside the boundaries of the actual offices. So, to keep these people sane, because that must be quite difficult to have this secret life that you're living. They set up all these little social groups within the agency, so they have little like quiz nights and stuff, and they do, you know, it's like a normal workplace really, but they have to do all that, I think, to keep the people to establish a kind of social side to it, because it's so strange for these people to have to go outside and to socialise, but not to be able to tell their friends or even their family what it is they actually do during the daytime. So. It's kind of peculiar way to live. But
It is, and yet it feels that the spy, the artist, the gonzo anthropologist / journalist have quite a lot in common.
Yeah.
I want to open this up to you guys. It's long past the time that we did that. Could we possibly have the house lights up and hands in the air for questions?
Thank you. It's really interesting. I guess I'm quite interested in these similarities between all these different types of actors, and I think hacking is kind of this super broad and quite confusing term that can mean a lot of different things in different contexts. And I wonder if, I mean, particularly in reference to Simon's exhibition, at what point do the similarities between hacking and kind of management culture end or become dangerous?
Is this a question to me?
Yeah.
Well, anyone, yeah.
At what point do the connections between hacking and management become dangerous? I would ask a different question, maybe, in response to that question. I see these as two different sites for kind of people doing things, people organizing, let's say. And I think social dynamics and organizational dynamics and motivational dynamics are kind of working in different ways between them. And I think within hacking they're framed in a certain way, and within management they're framed in another way. I'm making a narrative out of them being very connected. Other people wouldn't make that narrative. So I don't think that I don't think that's dangerous necessarily. I think that if there's danger in ways of bringing people together, it's not located in one discipline. I don't think management's dangerous, and I don't think hacking's dangerous per se. I think that setting up systems where people are encouraged to behave in certain ways and kind of taking into account both what Brett has said and what Ryan said, where you set up a system where it kind of naturalizes a certain kind of behavior. There's obviously extreme moments in history where we know that that leads to really disgusting things happening. And I guess it's about understanding what's going on in different contexts rather than saying management, the things that are going on in management are bad, or the things that are going on in hacking are bad. Maybe you have something else to say about that.
Yeah, go for it, Brett.
Yeah, I just want to, think about the history of management, or if you look at, say, critical management studies, the essence of management was always to, how do you get the most out of your workers, right? Your original management theories were sort of very like exploitative, if you like sort of Frederick Taylor, I think, the original kind of, treat your workers like cogs in a machine and extract as much wealth out of them. And you can put them into like a Marxist context, which is basically the managers are a layer of people to basically extract as much surplus value out of your workers as possible for your shareholders of your company, all right? And that was like the original sort of management structure. But over time, that structure is being got more and more bureaucratic and criticized. So like in a lot of the sort of 1980s and stuff, your management structures were encouraged to become more fluid and flexible and innovative, right? So breaking down the bureaucracy implicit in management structures. So within that context, hacker culture actually became quite appealing for a lot of big companies. Because part of the essence of, at least one element of the hacker culture is this whole sort of obsession around tinkering and curiosity and playful positivity. And if you take that element of hacker culture and you isolate it and you put it into an innovation context within a corporation, that's a very appealing thing. One of the critiques you might develop about that, though, is that that's a very particular element of hacker culture. If you look at hacker culture and sort of holistic perspective, a lot of what the original desire to mess with products and innovate was based on a desire to break the original intent of the powerful owners of those things. So, for example, look at like jailbreaking iPhones, for example. What's the point of this? You have the Apple designers and the Apple or the legal people saying this is how you interact with this thing. Then the people, like the hacker community, says no, we're going to redefine how we interact with this thing, right? Now that's actually a rebellious impulse, but it also takes a form of kind of a creative innovation at the same time. Now, if you want to strip that into a corporate context, you take the creative element of it and you strip it away from the rebellious element and you kind of put it into the hackathon context, etc. So that's
Conceivably, one could argue that there was a kind of extreme decadence in either doing that or accepting that. And if you put that if you put that tendency over here, and what was going on in the Egyptian revolution over there, where the similar sort of tools were being used actually in the cause of trying to make a better society, then I think there is quite a serious sliding scale between these kind of activities. But surely, Simon, your title of your show says it all, because it's about products for organising, and you have taken ideas and pieces of history and turned them into sculptural objects, products. You're talking about the commercialisation of human impulse.
Right. Yeah. So again, I guess that's maybe another thing. I mean, I like buying stuff, and I like clothes, and I've got a new iWatch, and it was a gift from my girlfriend actually. But I'm really into like stuff, and so I'm always like really happy when I come across a product that excites me, and that captures my attention and my time, and it captures my friends' attention and their time. So I just was such a fan of the way that products make something really lovable, and so I thought to kind of condense what is quite a complex history into cute, beautiful things that might be like fun to think about and hold or look at or whatever. That was a great way of telling a story. So I think again, I think commercialization's a complex thing to apply to things. I think I would ask what isn't commercialized, and I don't think commercialization is necessarily an evil process or a bad process, and I don't think products are necessarily evil or bad. In fact, I'm a fan of kind of all of that stuff, and to kind of bring that together, to use that to tell a story about hacking is, that's what Products for Organizing is all about.
I don't know if the revolutionary wants to respond to that, but that we do have some more questions, which is great.
I just wanted to ask, what does the panel think is the inherent moral worth of messing with things, of hacking things? We heard democracy, we heard empathy, we heard kind of breaking down boundaries, which sounds like kind of being a bit smarter, because if you're in your polarized binary, you're entrenched and you're not going to be thinking as broadly. We had in Egypt, when you messed with things, and arguably they might have got worse after. I mean, that's the sort of problem we've had with the Middle East and Western interventions, that they kind of got worse than the thing we were trying to solve. So I'd just be interested in any articulations about, is there anything morally inherently good about messing with things that are stable and well-formed?
Ryan. Sorry, but I do think that's a question that Ryan should address, because I think there's a very clear moral impulse in what you're doing.
Well, yeah, I guess like from my perspective, the work that I do in the last couple of years, my whole life has basically been devoted to going through these Snowden documents and writing stories about them. And I guess that's messing with the spy community and the powerful government structures and all that. And I guess so then the question is, what comes out of that? For me, what's come out of it is not necessarily reforms, because we've not actually seen many reforms in the US. There's maybe been a couple of laws that have changed, but here the government sort of doubled down and actually tried to do more extreme spying, even though it's already doing some of the most extreme spying in the world. But I think what for me is important is the cultural sort of awareness of people, this sort of collective consciousness, if you want to call it that. The education that comes out of reporting on these documents, the leaks, and how they've informed. I mean, actually, I was watching, it's kind of ridiculous, but the new X-Files that's come out, and just I see bits of the Snowden revelations being referenced in that, and how it seeps into popular culture, and it just changes people's awareness. I think it, in some ways, has changed the behaviour of people. Massive technology companies now, like WhatsApp, one of the biggest app instant messenger companies, is implementing end-to-end encryption to stop government spying on their messages, and they've got like almost 1 billion users now. So changes like that wouldn't have happened before these revelations. So I think for me, what comes out of messing with big government structures and doing this kind of reporting or maybe any kind of reporting of that kind, is that it informs people and that it slowly contributes towards like kind of cultural evolution, if you could put it like that, and just how we behave as a society.
Are you not frustrated that it's been, in a way, you'd have thought this could have brought the government down, in fact, but it was very far from the case, and actually, apart from, actually artists have been much more alive to this than anyone else, but in the populace at large, there's been a kind of supreme indifference in this country, in contrast to Germany, Brazil, many other countries in the world that have been taking these stories incredibly seriously. Do you not find it frustrating that there is?
It's kind of frustrating, but I mean, that again is also about our kind of cultural history and political history in this country. I mean, the Germans had the SS, the Gestapo, the Stasi. The Americans had their revolution, where a large part of that was actually resisting the British colonizers raiding their homes, the general warrant. That was why they ended up with the Fourth Amendment in the Constitution, which is, protects them against unreasonable searches and seizures. But we didn't have that here, and kind of bizarrely, it's because the British Empire, as it were, has always kind of been the colonizer or the oppressor, as opposed to us being the oppressed as a people. And so we've not had that experience in our history of like a really grave abuse that's been perpetrated against us by the state, like what the Germans had or like what the US had. And so I think that is a huge part of it, of why we don't have the same reaction here. Really, it's got to be why it is. And so I mean, it can be frustrating when you do these really huge like revelations come out, and then it falls like a lead balloon, people hear. But I think that in the scheme of it, it's still important because you're entering something into the public record that wasn't there before. It's important for historical reasons, for people to be able to look back on it, for people to slowly become more educated about what on earth it is their government is actually doing. I mean, we are supposed to be a democracy. We're supposed to have some idea about what it is, where our taxes are going, the government we elect, how they're actually functioning. And so I think the effect is not necessarily an instant one. It's not necessarily about the instant outrage, say. It's actually about the prolonged influence over time and how it changes just how people think about things.
Can I add to that? Well, I just wanted to say that I think it's also very difficult to generalize about these very different contexts. I mean, I think hacking is just a tool, and like, what's the alternative? We just sit silently to the status quo. I mean, in the case of the Arab Spring, many things failed, yet in the same case that the Snowden leaks spurred this conversation that has found its way into pop culture, the same thing is happening in the Middle East. And so I think, and there are many ways in which people can approach hacking. I mean, in my case, I think humor is a really interesting way to subvert the narrative and start a discussion. But I don't think that the end result is ever the same, right? I think it's so dependent on context and region and politics and culture.
One of the things I really enjoyed about Simon's show is how it operates spatially, using the specific architecture of Serpentine Sackler galleries to tell this kind of elliptical story, and with all of these connections between the histories of hacking and management. So I was thinking who this story reaches when told in the medium of this exhibition, and I'm wondering what the panel thinks about what the context of art can bring to telling the types of stories that you're all involved in telling. And to put it another way, specifically to Simon, what can you do in the art field that is different to what you could do in journalism or documentary filmmaking or whatever?
Simon.
Yeah, I think that I'm going to answer very subjectively to that because I don't know. I think I've never made a real documentary film. I've never done real journalism. I've only been fans of these kinds of things. And I think doing a good anything, any kind of cultural product or any kind of activity, is a craft. And exhibition making is something that I've worked on for a long time, and there's a certain platform for that, and that has a certain sphere of influence, which is different than that of journalism and different than that of documentary filmmaking. And so I think that probably art exhibitions aren't as able to reverberate as other more, transportable experiences, to refer back to your sculptural reflection. But that doesn't, I don't have a problem with that. I think that there are other amazing people doing kind of similar kinds of work in other fields. And I'm a fan of art, and that's my favorite kind of format. And exhibitions are my favorite kind of format. So, yeah, that's kind of...
I think, if I could jump in, just as a journalist, I think it's completely gripping what an artist sees or what an artist can do compared with what a journalist can do. And there's been, actually particularly in theatre, there's been quite an efflorescence of plays based on stuff in the news and taking, including the Snowden story, things like phone hacking, and the Occupy movement and so on and so forth. And there's always something else, because journalism, love it as I do, it does, and I expect Ryan would agree with this, does operate within a certain set framework, a certain number of templates. I mean, Hiba has obviously critiqued those as an artist, as we saw in her first slide, very effectively. It's probably true that most journalists are engaged themselves in small acts of culture hacking every day, because we're always trying to stretch those templates or undermine them or do something slightly different. But we're never really going to be able to make a sculpture on our website or newspaper. And it seemed to me that, particularly with the Venice exhibition that Simon did, he had taken very similar information to the information that most journalists had. Instead of looking at the words on the page and think, what is the written information, what is the stuff, he looked at the aesthetics of the organisation. And actually there's a huge amount of information, just a really different kind of information, to be gleaned from that. I thought it was hugely impressive. But anyway...
But I think I can add to that as a very concrete outcome of that, is this idea of attributing those slides. So, they're kind of, by their very secrecy, nobody made them or whatever. And this idea of finding a kind of like somebody that kind of could claim that they had something to do with it, came through aesthetic research. So that's kind of like, it came through me being a fan of the style of this material and looking for somebody who contributed to that in some kind of a way and imagining an artistic context for that.
You were doing a sort of Morelli-esque connoisseurship on the NSA slides,
right,
and thus able to attribute it.
Right, because for example, the New Zealand John Key, the New Zealand Prime Minister, up until also probably past the exhibition, was saying that they were just complete fiction. I mean, there are people in the governmental side and who are saying that this is just that they're not real, And if you have somebody saying, actually, yes, I designed this fantastic logo, which you did also with the piece that you wrote about the show. That was kind of a connecting dot, that was a kind of that's one of the things that you can say that that aesthetic research brought us to.
Exactly.
So yeah. But did that answer your question at all? Yeah.
I just have a quick question. You've spoken a lot about GCHQ and Five Eyes. But there is oversight there, however horrible it is. But a lot of the conversation today has actually been about the large corporations, about Twitter and Facebook and Google and WhatsApp. And my question, I suppose, is, do you think enough in the art context, in the art world, and is being done to kind of question how they're going about and the huge realms of data that they have that isn't really regulated and there isn't that much oversight on?
That's a good question. Who wants to take it on?
I'll take it on a little bit. I think that's a really good question, because companies like Google and Facebook wield extraordinary power, and one of the things that I've been quite fascinated in kind of observing is the way that they're able to control and censor information. Sometimes not deliberately, but because they're running algorithms now that detect supposedly offensive content, and they can dictate flows of information, and they can remove information, and there is no accountability, and it seems to almost be the way that they can control information in that way is almost kind of arbitrary. There's no, as you say, oversight of it, and I'm not sure how it's possible to address it, because they're private sector actors. You know, they operate out with the public sphere. We don't really unless, I mean, the only thing that we can do is not use those we can choose to avoid those platforms or whatever it is, but you know, we don't necessarily have that choice because we might need to communicate using them. But yeah, it's a really interesting subject to think about, and I think that, I mean, the change will probably can come from like consumer pressure, forcing the companies themselves to be more accountable. We've seen like Google and Facebook in recent years putting out for transparency reports and things about how they handle people's information, which is kind of a progressive step. But I think that a lot more definitely needs to be done about that. And I also agree with you that they probably don't get enough, as much scrutiny as what they should do.
Oh, there are some job openings for artists here, I see. I mean, there are artists who have. Didn't Ryan Trecartin use the formula of Facebook to and subvert it and cause it to sort of bend it to his own narrative means? That people are working in these frameworks, but it feels like, as you say, there's much more to be done.
Yeah. Well, I've done one project, or now two projects, that implicate the tech. The governmental side of things, and I've done about 100 projects about the tech sector. You know,
Right.
So it's like that's a huge part of. I see, again, not to be banging on about the same thing. I see this whole thing as part of a continuum, that the commercial tech sector, and I think that's also what came out with the Snowden material was whether they wanted it or not, they were a part of state apparatus anyhow, and also a kind of the data gathering that these companies do enables this kind of state oversight aspect of it. So I'm again a huge fan of tech culture and how it works, and there's a lot to look at there, and I have a lot of artist friends, Ryan being one of them, but there's many people actually working on social media and giant tech companies and what they do and what they implicate, and I can give you a huge
I
list.
feel like, in fact, it's happening very much within the art circles.
Totally.
I think the problem is does it get out beyond the art? I think that's the issue, is does it reach beyond that? But very much within the art world, this conversation is very present.
Yeah.
I would say briefly as well, just there is a huge overlap between, it's not necessarily this like black and white thing. I mean, especially in the US, but also in the UK, there are huge companies that people don't really, I mean, some of them people do know, like BAE Systems is one of the big ones. They have a very close relationship with GCHQ and the other intelligence agencies in this country. Also, in the US, I mean, Snowden himself, he worked for a private contractor. He worked for a company, I can't, their name
Booz Allen
Hamilton, yeah. And so I mean, there is a huge overlap there, and the government, in fact, oftentimes is relying on the private sector to provide some of these surveillance services. So they're not always, it's not always a black and white.
And that building is also all about that. It's a the GCHQ headquarters is a privately funded building. It's the government didn't pay for that. It was British Telecom in collaboration with a security company called For something and Carillion. And I mean, one of the texts in the book also that talks to this idea is by Keller Easterling, and her book Extra Statecraft was all, I mean, for me reading it. And I'm sure there's many other texts that do this, but it's also all about saying that this idea of kind of the opposites of public and private institutions is just like, it's not a very useful categorization term anymore. It's just simply not useful. It's that everything's private, everything's with private. The school's probably private. I mean, I don't know, it's kind of like, it's public and private is just not a useful categorization system anymore.
I mean, I think also in the same ways that we talk about artists who critique the systems, we also need to acknowledge those who are perpetuating the system. So a series like Homeland is an extension of the security state, and in fact they work with the CIA and make no qualms about it. Their season 4 premiere was at the CIA headquarters, and in fact the writers of Homeland also, who are the same writers as 24, there was this kind of narrative of supporting torture. And in fact, that became a Supreme Court case that used 24 as an example as to why, you know, torture should be used. So that overlap is also incredibly important to raise within that narrative.
It's a kind of propaganda. I mean, I do think Britain has got a messed up relationship with spies, partly because of James Bond, and we have a history of, you know, culturally being quite keen on spies and glamorising them.
But in the recent Bond film,
Yeah,
there was the
interesting.
bad guy
Yeah.
was the young tech dude.
Yeah.
Like, so that's also again.
Well, in
like
Homeland also, the enemy is the whistleblower,
Right.
is Laura Poitras, actually.
Yeah. No. But actually, the Bond one was more consistent, maybe, with what potentially, you know,
I
like
think you're right. I think
the
they've been
good
a little-
old dusty spies
Yeah.
who were analog were the good guys, and the kind of young, possibly neolib guy that was kind of transforming it into something more tech savvy was like the bad guy working with the evil people. So that's kind of an interesting.
I'll just add something on, just to go back to, in the public imagination and this general debate, there's always this obsession with overt abuse as the most damaging thing in society. So somebody punched me in the face, or like I was attacked, or like it was. There's always very like obvious things, and actually in the science field, there's a field called responsible innovation, and you know, so what this idea that scientists, when they're designing things, are supposed to think about the ethical implications of what they're creating. And historically, that's always done exactly the same thing. It's like, what happens if our work is used to create a nuclear bomb that annihilates humanity? All right, what happens if it's used to spy on people? And this is like a very common thing. What people are much less able to, or much less equipped or trained to think about, are subtle hegemonic forces that you can't really experience or articulate or tell. And those are much more insidious often, and actually you find them extensively in the corporate sector. So we're used to the government doing all like the government is spying on you, this blunt kind of thing. But what about the way that your everyday life is constantly being steered by forces you don't even understand in much more subtle and unaccountable ways? And I think that's the real interesting political challenge going forward with all the tech companies, is that the entrepreneurs themselves are not trained to think like that either. And part of the problem you have in startup culture is that there's an incredible myopia, or that's the right word, this very narrow worldview, which is we apply our whatever, our hacker skills or whatever, how they conceptualize themselves, to solving all these individual small problems and being very innovative in the process. And we're very good at explaining that and conceptualizing that, but we're completely inept at conceptualizing the collective impact of our actions. And nobody in the business schools are trained to think like that at all. So while I appreciate the sort of the thinking about, you know, is Facebook abusing you, I think it's also important to think more broadly about the collective implications. And that's a bit vague, I know, but.
I have a question for the whole panel, really. Just bring a little bit up about aesthetics. When you're going into these different cultures that you're maybe not initially part of, like the financial sector or tech culture, how do you go about crystallizing a sense of how they look, or particularly, Simon, your exhibitions, they really sum up, like you can see exactly what tech culture looks like all of a sudden, even though I had no sense of that before. How do you go about like creating an aesthetic that we can all see and understand as well?
Thank you. And to the front, please.
Hi, we actually have two questions next to each other. Sorry, Charlotte.
Okay.
So the question kind of comes from Hiba's work and how it connects to what an artist's sort of position is in a state of, let's say, siege, whether that be military or cultural or surveillance-based or something like this. So, you know, this kind of negotiating between between sort of having to be quite direct about certain things that are political, and also having to take away or sort of hide away other ways of being or operating within the sphere of society or politics or media even. And so I wanted to ask you a little bit about, actually everyone, a little bit about this kind of cryptographic sort of half formal, half informal work that one does, because Simon, you mentioned Keller Easterling's book, and Keller Easterling's book does reveal quite a few sort of sensitive tricks of people who are also embedded in those organizations and working to change them. So in a way, I'm wagering that probably what all of you do, sort of, there's more to what you do than meets the eye. So I guess it's a question that you can't really answer, which is good that I'm Amir
They'll have a go. What's the second question from the front row? Because we should wind
Well,
up.
actually, it's a nice follow-up to what Lucia was just saying. And my question is also a little bit of a comment, and it's in relation to the potentiality of the art world to become a platform to raise awareness, or also the potentiality of hacker culture to tease out or inform, let's say, a general public. And it's actually going back to what you were saying, Heba, to this idea that 5 years ago we saw almost the shutdown of the internet, but most recently, and only it's been happening for the past month, it's the shutdown of art institutions in Cairo. And that's a really important actually series of events that has been happening, with the police raids going and shutting down these places that have acted as a platform for people to participate in a conversation and engage with what's happening. And what's happening right now is that not only because of that do we have an emergence of a number of platforms that are trying to deal with this situation, but there is also this idea, there is this kind of uncanny silence that's happening because there is a mass paranoia of what's happening. So it's this kind of relationship and ambiguity between cultural production and how cultural production can also be related or is inherently tied to authority or certain systems of authorities. So, I mean, I don't expect an answer to this. I think it's a much wider conversation, and it's in no way answered in 30 seconds, but.
Should we, let's first of all take this notion, I think that the first two of those three questions can work together a little bit. This sort of sense of how do you make it work? You know, what's the process? What's the methodology? How do you start and then end up with an exhibition or end up with an investigative news story? What's the process? Do you think, am I kind of getting there broadly? So if you could address the first question, which I very badly summarised. The first and second question.
Just I try to just get as close to the material as possible. I try to go to conferences. I try to talk to people who are working in that sector. I subscribe to news posts. I subscribe to different types of things. Look at websites, whatever. I just get obsessed and spend all day. Luckily, like soaking up this culture, and then I see what I can make out of that. I mean, that's just a very quick.
It is, isn't it? It's because you're missing out the arriving at some kind of aesthetic solution, which is probably that's the sort of tough bit.
Yeah, as artists, that's what we're trained to do, though, right?
Yeah.
You know, is that we're so invested in these topics that we're interested in, and what we're trained to do is actually transform that into something aesthetic and something that's contemplative, and that's, I suppose, you know, where art differs from, you know, other fields, is that it's not I would say the responsibility shouldn't be on the artist to kind of deal with these very serious issues, but it is a space in which we can address these things, but it's not expected that I mean, it shouldn't be expected. But I think, you know, what the tools and the skills that we do learn going through art school or being invested in art is that we're not just critical, but then it's about how to take it a step further and kind of present it in this narrative or in this way that might pose further questions and not necessarily answers.
Yes, of course.
I'll attempt to. Are we closing fairly soon?
Yes.
Because I just wanted to maybe just sum up some of my opinions on this and try to vaguely answer these questions at the same time. I'll probably just say something obscure though. So let's accept that artists and hackers have similarities. Okay, so we can agree with this, and part of the similarities is actually their appreciation of ambiguity. Actually, artists don't like to be pinned down often, you know, and this is always historically a problem with activist movements and artists, is that activist movements want instrumental art, like make this, you know, propaganda for us, whereas artists are a bit like, that's a bit like, that's, you know, so but hackers have a similar kind of thing. It's like, don't pin me down, right? And actually, you can notice that essentially in a lot of, at least in one tradition of both of these, is that there's quite an individualistic enterprise often, and a lot of what hacking is about, at least, is as much a self-help movement as an actual authentic political kind of response. So like what a lot of hackers are doing is they're trying to understand the world that they're part of and de-alienate themselves and understand it, and then maybe then they can do something with it, but it's not guaranteed at all. It's mostly a self-empowering process, all right? And the historical issue is how do you then connect that to authentic social movements? And really there's no, and this is kind of goes back to what you're saying, is actually sometimes innovation's trivial, you know, like tinkering. Okay, cool, I learned something, but who gives a shit, you know? Like, and that's always, there's like a kind of uneasy dynamic. And I think with hacker groups, you really have to, and maybe with artists as well, you have to kind of find these sort of, some kind of solution for how do you make a hack that's more than just a temporary breach in the matrix, right? And actually become something that's much more meaningful over time. Anyway, that's my...
Well, it's a great way of bringing us to the end, to the close of this discussion, I think, because because what you're describing is, again, the sort of idea that there's a spectrum of activities, and actually at the hard end of that, the instrumental end of that is Ryan. And you know, he really does want to bring the government down, like all good journalists. He wants to and you know, and he a revolutionary. And so all these things, you know, operating within the same spectrum of
Does that make me the
methodology.
softest?
You're the end of days, mate. You're the first to go when the line never gets. But I'm teasing you, Simon. As you know, I'm sorry for insulting you in that terrible way. But
I love it. Yeah.
Please really join me in thanking our fabulous panellists for what I think was a really interesting evening. Thank you.